My name is Alicia Carter. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my life, my family believed my work was nothing more than a childish hobby. I run a pottery and ceramics studio in Albuquerque, a business I built from a dusty garage, shaping clay with my own hands and shipping fragile boxes of handmade pieces across the country. For years, they laughed at it, called it cute, something I would eventually grow out of. Meanwhile, every dollar of respect, attention, and family pride flowed in one direction, toward my younger sister, and the future everyone said she was destined for. I stayed quiet through all of it. I listened to the jokes at family dinners, the casual dismissals, the way my work was always described as playing with clay. I watched my parents take out loans, refinance their house, and pour everything into her education while I built my own life without asking them for a single thing. What they never realized was that the little studio they ignored had quietly turned into something much bigger than they imagined. The truth came out on the night of my brother's graduation dinner. The restaurant was crowded, the lights low, everyone pretending it was a celebration. I slid a small envelope across the table to him. A simple gift, something I had arranged weeks earlier. Inside were the keys and the deed to a house, paid in full. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then my father leaned forward, his face pale with fury, and said the one sentence that exposed everything. "That money was for your sister's loans." That was the moment I realized my family had never seen me as a daughter, just a bank account they hadn't unlocked yet. Before I tell you what he said, and what happened after I walked out, tell me, what time is it for you right now, and where are you watching from? I'm curious to see how far this story will travel. 3 days before that dinner, I was lying in bed with a fever that made my entire body feel heavy and slow. The winter air in Albuquerque was dry and cold, but the chill running through my bones had nothing to do with the weather. I had spent 2 days wrapped in blankets, ignoring emails from the studio, and letting orders pile up while I tried to sweat out whatever flu had hit me. My pottery workshop usually smelled like wet clay and kiln heat, but that morning the only thing around me was silence and the dull vibration of my phone on the nightstand. When the screen lit up, I already knew who it was. Mom. I let it ring twice before answering. My voice sounded rough even to my own ears. She didn't waste time asking how I was feeling. Her tone was bright, almost impatient, the way it always became when she had already decided what she wanted from me. She said they were short on money again. "Just a temporary gap," she explained, "the kind of thing families handle together." My younger sister's tuition payment was due soon, and apparently the last installment was larger than expected. My parents had already stretched their finances, taken out loans, moved things around, done everything they could. Now they only needed a little help to push things across the finish line. The number she mentioned hung in the air long after she said it. $15,000. She said it casually, as if she were asking me to cover dinner. For a moment, I just stared at the ceiling above my bed, trying to decide whether I was too sick to think clearly, or if this conversation was exactly what it sounded like. Because this wasn't the first time. For years, every financial emergency in my family had somehow circled back to my sister's education. Every scholarship gap, every tuition increase, every unexpected expense became a crisis that required sacrifice from everyone else. My parents had refinanced their home once already. They had taken out private loans. They talked about it constantly, always framing it as an investment in the future. Their future. Whenever my name came up during those conversations, it was always in a different tone. Polite. Dismissive. My pottery studio was never called a business. It was always my little workshop, the place where I spent my time shaping bowls and mugs while real careers happened somewhere else. At family gatherings, they asked if I was still selling handmade cups online, the same way someone might ask if a teenager was still running a lemonade stand during summer break. I stopped correcting them years ago. What they never noticed was how that little workshop slowly changed. Orders began arriving from outside New Mexico, then outside the region, then from states I had never even visited. Restaurants started buying custom sets. Galleries asked about limited runs of ceramic pieces. At some point, the storage shelves in my garage weren't enough anymore, so I rented a small industrial unit and installed my first kiln that could fire hundreds of pieces at once. I never told my parents how much the studio was making, not because I wanted to hide it, mostly because they never asked. The only numbers that interested them were the ones tied to my sister's future. While Mom kept talking on the phone, explaining interest rates and deadlines and how close everything was to working out, I slowly pushed myself upright against the pillows. My head was still pounding, but another feeling had started to replace the fog of the fever. A familiar kind of clarity. She said this would be the last time they needed help. Just one final push so my sister could graduate without financial stress. After that, everything would change. Once she finished school and started earning real money, the entire family would benefit from the investment they had made in her. That word again. Investment. I had heard it so many times growing up that it almost sounded normal. But lying there in the quiet room, listening to my mother explain why $15,000 was suddenly my responsibility, I realized something strange. No one in my family had ever described me as an investment, not once. The next morning, I woke up with the strange clarity that always follows a long night of restless sleep. The fever had broken, but something else had settled in its place, a quiet unease that refused to fade. My body still felt weak, yet my mind kept circling the same thought over and over again. It wasn't the amount my mother had asked for. $15,000 was a lot, but it wasn't impossible for me. What bothered me was the way the conversation had unfolded, the expectation behind it, as if the decision had already been made somewhere without me. That feeling pulled an old memory back to the surface. A few months earlier, we had all been sitting around my parents' dining table after a late dinner. It was one of those evenings when the conversation drifted between safe topics, work updates, casual family gossip, and the usual praise directed toward my sister's progress in medical school. I had mostly stayed quiet, listening the way I always did, until my father suddenly turned his attention toward me. He asked about the pottery studio. At the time, the question had surprised me. My father rarely showed interest in what I did. If he mentioned the studio at all, it was usually with the polite detachment someone might use when acknowledging a hobby. But that night, his tone had been different. Focused, curious. He wanted to know how the business was structured. Was it just me running everything? Did I have partners? How were the finances organized? What kind of legal protection did I have if something went wrong with a shipment or a customer claim? The questions had come one after another, calm and measured, the way someone might examine a set of numbers they were trying to understand. At the time, I had answered casually. I explained that the studio had grown, that I had employees now, that our orders came from restaurants and collectors all over the country. I mentioned shipping contracts and supply orders from clay distributors in Arizona and California. My father had nodded along, occasionally asking another question about ownership or liability. I remembered the exact moment his expression had tightened. It happened when I mentioned that the business wasn't technically mine alone anymore. The studio had been reorganized years earlier with legal protections built into its structure. The details were complicated, and I had never seen the need to explain them to anyone outside my advisors. My father's smile had stiffened for a second. Then the conversation had shifted back to my sister. At the time, I thought nothing of it, but lying in bed that morning, replaying that dinner in my mind, the entire exchange felt different. It no longer sounded like curiosity. It sounded like reconnaissance. The thought sat in my chest long enough that I finally reached for my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found the number I was looking for. Victor Hale. Victor had been helping me with legal matters related to the studio for several years. He handled contracts, licensing issues, and the occasional dispute that came with selling handcrafted pieces across different states. More importantly, He had been the one who convinced me to organize the business properly once it started growing faster than I expected. When he answered the call, I kept my explanation simple. I told him I had a strange feeling about something. I described the phone call from my mother, the sudden request for money, and the questions my father had asked months earlier about how my company was structured. None of it sounded dramatic when spoken out loud, yet Victor didn't interrupt or dismiss it as paranoia. Instead, he asked a few careful questions. Did my parents have significant debts? Had they taken loans for my sister's education? Did my father still work in financial advising the way he used to? I didn't know the answers to most of those questions. My parents rarely talked about their finances with me unless they were explaining how expensive medical school had become. The details were always vague, wrapped in the same language about sacrifice and family support. Victor told me he could look into some things: public financial records, property filings, loan registrations. Nothing invasive, nothing illegal. Just information that was already available if someone knew where to search. 2 days later, he called me back. His voice was calm, but there was no hesitation in what he said. My parents had refinanced their house not once, but twice. There were multiple private loans attached to my sister's education, each carrying interest rates far higher than federal student aid. Some of the loans were recent, taken within the last year. When Victor finished explaining the numbers, the total sat in my mind like a weight: more than $500,000. For the first time, the request for $15,000 made sense. It wasn't tuition. It was interest. 2 days later, my father called. I was back at the pottery studio by then, standing beside the long wooden work table where unfinished bowls were drying in neat rows. The building was quiet except for the low hum of the kiln in the back room and the soft scratch of clay against my palms as I smoothed the rim of a cup that had warped slightly overnight. When my phone vibrated in my pocket, his name appeared on the screen. Dad rarely called me directly. When he did, it usually meant something practical: taxes, insurance, advice he thought I needed but never asked for. I wiped the clay from my hands before answering, already knowing the conversation would circle back to the same subject my mother had raised. His voice sounded calm, almost friendly. He said he had been thinking about the future of the family. My sister's education was nearly complete, my brother was about to graduate, and it was time for everyone to start planning the next stage of life in a more coordinated way. Families, he explained, were strongest when their resources were managed together. I listened without interrupting. The explanation stretched on for several minutes. My father spoke the way he always did when discussing money, using phrases that sounded carefully practiced: long-term strategy, shared opportunity, financial synergy between generations. Eventually, the proposal appeared in the middle of that speech. He wanted to create what he called a family investment fund. The idea, according to him, was simple. Each member of the family would contribute what they could. My parents would bring their remaining assets. My sister would eventually contribute once she began earning as a doctor, and my brother could join once his career stabilized. The fund would be managed carefully, growing over time, protecting everyone from financial instability. Then he mentioned my role in the plan. The pottery studio had grown more than anyone expected, he said. I was doing well, far better than he originally assumed. If a portion of the business profits were redirected into the family fund each year, the entire household could benefit. My father would manage the investments himself, ensuring the money was allocated wisely. He said it as though the arrangement was obvious. While he talked, I walked slowly through the studio, passing shelves filled with finished ceramic pieces waiting to be packed for shipping. The sunlight coming through the high windows reflected softly off the glazed surfaces, turning rows of bowls and cups into quiet lines of color. For a moment, I imagined the plan exactly as he described it: my business profits flowing into an account controlled by him, those funds slowly disappearing into the same debts Victor had uncovered: my sister's loans, my parents' refinancing, interest accumulating faster than anyone admitted. The realization felt strangely calm. My father believed he had finally discovered the value of the daughter he ignored for years. He thought the small pottery studio he once dismissed had become a convenient solution to a financial problem. He still assumed I was naive about how money moved. When he paused long enough for me to respond, I told him something he clearly didn't expect. The studio wasn't structured the way he imagined. Years earlier, when the business first began expanding beyond my control, Victor had insisted on reorganizing everything. Ownership had been divided into legal layers designed to protect the company from lawsuits, creditors, and unexpected financial pressure. The system made it extremely difficult for anyone to move large amounts of money without clear justification tied to the operation of the studio itself. In simple terms, the profits weren't something I could casually withdraw and transfer into a family investment account. There was a long silence on the other end of the line. I could almost picture my father sitting in his office, trying to process what I had just said. For a man who spent most of his life advising other people about money, the idea that his own daughter had structured her finances outside his control seemed almost offensive. When he finally spoke again, the friendliness in his voice had disappeared. He asked why I would create such a complicated system without consulting him. The question hung in the air between us. I looked around the studio again, at the racks of pottery drying in the warm air, the tools scattered across the table, the evidence of a business built piece by piece without help from anyone else in my family. The answer was simple, because he had never once believed the studio was real. By the end of that week, the conversation with my father had already settled into something quiet and final in my mind. I didn't call him back. I didn't argue. I didn't try to convince anyone in my family that what they were asking from me was unreasonable. For years, I had watched the same pattern repeat itself whenever money became part of the discussion. Every explanation eventually turned into guilt. Every refusal was treated like betrayal, and every sacrifice was expected to come from the same direction. So instead of continuing the argument, I turned my attention somewhere else. My brother's graduation dinner was approaching. He had just accepted his first engineering job across town, a position at a small manufacturing company on the north side of Albuquerque. The job wasn't glamorous, but it was stable, and for the first time in years, I had heard real excitement in his voice when he talked about the future. There was only one problem. Housing in the city had become expensive, especially for someone just starting a career. During our last conversation, he mentioned that he might have to move back into our parents' house for a while, until he could save enough money to rent something closer to work. The idea sat uncomfortably with me. My brother had spent most of his life existing quietly in the background of our family. While my sister received constant attention for every academic milestone, he moved through school almost unnoticed, solving problems on his own, never asking for recognition. He never complained about the imbalance, but it was impossible not to see it. For years, the family narrative had only included one success story. Everyone else was expected to orbit around it. That afternoon, I called a real estate agent whose number I had saved months earlier while researching commercial space for the studio. Instead of asking about properties for the business, I explained that I was looking for a small house, something practical, close enough to the industrial district where my brother's job would be located. The agent sent several listings within the hour. Most of them were modest homes built decades earlier, the kind of houses that had survived multiple owners without changing much. One of them stood out immediately. It was a single-story place on a quiet street. Not large, but well-maintained, with a small backyard and a garage big enough to hold a workshop if someone wanted to build things in their spare time. I scheduled a visit the next morning. The house smelled faintly of fresh paint when I stepped inside. Sunlight filtered through the windows onto the hardwood floor, and the rooms were simple enough that anyone could imagine living there without needing to change much. I walked slowly through the hallway, picturing my brother moving boxes into the living room, setting up a desk somewhere near the window, turning the garage into a place where he could experiment with mechanical projects the way he used to when we were younger. The decision didn't take long. Later that afternoon, I met the agent again at her office and started the paperwork. Because the pottery studio had been structured carefully over the years, I had separate investment accounts that existed entirely outside the company itself. The money came from profits accumulated gradually over time, funds I had never needed to touch while the business continued expanding. One transfer from that account was enough. The purchase price was $420,000. I paid the entire amount at once. The paperwork took several hours to complete. By the time everything was finalized, the house legally belonged to my brother. My name didn't appear on the property records at all. According to the documents, it was a gift transferred directly into his ownership. A few days later, I picked up the keys. They were lighter than I expected when I held them in my hand, attached to a small metal ring with a temporary label from the real estate office. I stood outside the house for a moment before leaving, looking at the quiet street and the rows of trees lining the sidewalk. Then I placed the keys inside a plain envelope and carried them home. The graduation dinner was the following night. The restaurant my mother chose for the graduation dinner sat on a busy street near the center of Albuquerque. It was the kind of place families picked when they wanted a celebration to look important. Soft lighting, polished wooden tables, quiet music drifting through the room, waiters moving carefully between groups of people dressed for special occasions. My parents were already seated when I arrived, my sister beside them, my brother across the table in a suit that still looked slightly unfamiliar on him. For a moment, everything looked normal. My mother smiled too brightly as I sat down, adjusting her napkin and asking polite questions about my health. My father kept his attention on the menu, occasionally glancing up with the restrained expression he used when pretending nothing was wrong. My sister looked confident and relaxed, the way someone does when the evening has been arranged entirely around their expectations. My brother was the only person who seemed uncertain. He kept shifting in his chair, looking around the table with the quiet awareness of someone who understood that celebrations in our family rarely stayed simple for long. Dinner unfolded slowly. Plates arrived, glasses were filled, and conversation moved through predictable topics. My mother spoke about how proud she was of the children she had raised. My sister described the hospital program she hoped to join after finishing medical school. My father nodded along, occasionally adding comments about the future and the importance of family support. No one mentioned the phone calls from earlier in the week. No one mentioned money. Yet the tension remained in the air, subtle but impossible to ignore. I could feel my father watching me when he thought I wasn't paying attention, measuring something silently in his mind. When the main course plates were cleared away, my mother lifted her glass and announced that it was time for a proper toast. She spoke about achievement and hard work, about the importance of ambition, about the bright future waiting ahead for our family. The speech drifted naturally toward my sister again, praising her discipline and dedication, reminding everyone how much sacrifice had gone into helping her reach this point. My brother listened quietly. When the toast ended, I reached down beside my chair and picked up the envelope I had brought with me. It was plain, nothing special, the same one that had been sitting on my desk since the afternoon I collected the house keys. I slid it across the table toward my brother. He looked confused at first, glancing at me as if trying to decide whether he had misunderstood something. Slowly, he opened the envelope and pulled out the folded papers inside. The room remained quiet as he read through the documents, his eyes moving across the page, stopping once, then returning to the top as if he needed to check the name printed there again. The silence stretched longer than anyone expected. My mother leaned forward slightly, curiosity replacing the practiced warmth she had worn all evening. My father's posture stiffened the moment he noticed the legal formatting of the paperwork. My brother finally looked up. The expression on his face was somewhere between disbelief and careful restraint, the kind of reaction that appears when someone receives something they never imagined asking for. The documents described the property clearly, a small house on a quiet street not far from his new workplace. The purchase price had been fully paid. Ownership transferred entirely into his name. For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then my father leaned forward across the table, his voice low enough that the surrounding diners wouldn't hear the first words he said. "That money was for your sister's loans." The sentence landed heavily in the middle of the table, stripping away the polite atmosphere the restaurant had tried to maintain. My mother's expression changed instantly, confusion collapsing into something sharper as she looked between the paperwork and my face. My sister's reaction was slower, but the meaning reached her eventually. I watched the realization move through each of them in different ways. My father calculating the amount he believed had disappeared. My mother trying to understand how something meant for one purpose had suddenly been used for another. My sister staring at the documents as if the pages themselves had broken some unspoken rule. Across from me, my brother still held the papers in both hands. For the first time that evening, he looked directly at our parents instead of avoiding their gaze. The quiet uncertainty he carried earlier had faded, replaced by a steadier expression that seemed to recognize something important had just been revealed. The envelope remained on the table between us. A week after the dinner, everything in my family began to unravel. The silence between us became permanent almost immediately. No dramatic confrontations followed that night, no attempts to repair the situation, no long emotional speeches about forgiveness. Instead, the distance grew quietly, the way fractures in a structure widen once pressure finally reaches the breaking point. My brother moved into the house within 2 weeks. Watching him carry his first boxes through the front door was one of the simplest moments of relief I had felt in years. The place suited him perfectly. The garage quickly filled with tools and half-assembled mechanical projects. The backyard became a quiet space where he could sit after work. And for the first time since we were kids, he looked like someone who actually belonged somewhere. Our parents did not visit. At first they tried calling him, but those conversations didn't last long. The reality of their financial situation had begun catching up with them faster than anyone expected. The loans tied to my sister's education carried aggressive interest rates, and without additional money flowing in, the payments became impossible to keep up with. Within months, the pressure started showing. My father's financial advisory business began losing clients once rumors about his debts circulated among people who trusted him with their investments. Clients rarely stay with advisors who appear unstable themselves. One by one, the accounts disappeared, and with them, the steady income he had relied on for years. My parents eventually sold their house. The sale covered only a portion of what they owed, leaving them with a smaller apartment across town and a stack of remaining obligations that could not be erased through bankruptcy. My sister finished medical school, but the financial burden attached to her degree followed her into the next stage of her life. Debt has a way of shaping choices. The prestigious hospital positions she once talked about were no longer available to someone carrying that much financial risk. Instead, she accepted a demanding position in a public health system several states away, a job chosen not for ambition, but for survival. We never spoke about any of it again. My brother focused on his engineering career and the small life he built inside that house. I continued running the pottery studio, expanding the workshop slowly, adding new kilns, hiring more employees, shipping ceramic pieces to restaurants and galleries across the country. Occasionally, my phone still received messages from unfamiliar numbers. Most of them came from my mother, usually short sentences about family responsibility or difficult circumstances. I stopped responding after the first few attempts. Eventually, I blocked the number completely. The silence that followed felt different from the silence that existed before. It was no longer the quiet of being ignored. It was the quiet of boundaries finally being enforced. Looking back now, the strangest part of the entire situation wasn't the anger or the money or the broken expectations. It was the realization that for years I had believed family loyalty required endless patience, endless compromise, endless understanding. But loyalty without respect eventually becomes exploitation. The night I handed my brother that envelope didn't destroy my family. It simply revealed the structure that had existed all along. Sometimes the most important thing you can build in life isn't a business or a house. Sometimes it's the courage to decide where your responsibility truly ends. Thank you for listening to my story. If you've ever faced a moment where protecting your own life meant stepping away from the people who expected to control it, then you already understand why some endings are necessary.